Welcome, everyone. I'm 40 minutes late, or am I 20 minutes early? You will never know. All right. Today is going to be it's going to be a little bit of a history lesson today. We're going to talk about the Black family. Uh, there is a book called "The Negro Family in the U.S." by E. Franklin Frazier. It was released in 1939. I don't think you can find an actual physical copy of this book, but I did manage to get a PDF file that's 700 and some odd pages. Now, it's impossible for me to read this entire thing. I have so many other books to read. But the Patrick Moynihan report that came out in the 1960s about the degradation of the Black family, it actually pointed to one of the sections that's in this book that I decided that we would take a look at today because it is absolutely one of the most um, looked over parts of history because we are told time and time again that what happened to the Black family is the legacy of slavery and all this junk, right? That's what we're told. We're told that the legacy of slavery caused all of this, all these problems, and it turns out it's not true. Obviously, right? That there's actually far more reasonable explanations for what happened to the Black family. So we're gonna start with the Patrick Moynihan report, which I believe was in the 1960s. We're gonna get a general idea. What year was this? 1965. So Moynihan is writing in 1965 about the dissolution of the Black family, and there is some important statistics in here. Again, this is 1965 about the falling apart of the family structure. This is at the height of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King is still alive. The Black Panthers have not started yet. They started in 1966. Um, so you have the NAACP, you've had Marcus Garvey, you've had W.E.B. Du Bois, you had all these people already. We're transitioning from civil rights to, I guess you could say, Black power, because the Civil Rights Act has been passed. I believe it was the 1964 Civil Rights Act has been passed already. It was passed by Lyndon Baines Johnson, even though, to be fair, it was going to be signed by John Kennedy until somebody decided to put a bullet in his head. So LBJ should not get any credit for the Civil Rights Act. JFK was working with Martin Luther King on the Civil Rights Act before he got shot. So all LBJ had to do was sign it. That's pretty much it. But you see in the Patrick Moynihan report that um, 22.9% of urban non-white families, that'd be 23% of urban non-white families, have absent husbands or divorces. 17% have a husband absent. 12.7 or 13% have his husband that has been separated or absent for other or separated. Almost 5% for some other reason. So I would imagine that would be death. And almost 6% for divorced. So now, to be fair, they say this survey was from 1960. Now, to be fair, it says non-white, so it could be, but there's not a lot of Latinos and Asians in the United States at this point in time. Almost no Arabs, right? So at this point, we're talking about blacks and whites. So of the black population, the majority black population, 23% have absent husbands and fathers. This is in 1960, right? So they show, they go through like a lot of this information. They show that it's mostly in the Northeast and the West Coast, where the black family has fallen apart. Even though it's above 20 in the Northeast and North Central, which I'm guessing is like Virginia, Carolina, I would imagine, and then the South, which I guess would be Mississippi, Tennessee, etc., and out West was 24%, almost a quarter. A quarter of the black families in the East Coast, the Northeast, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, etc., a quarter of those families have either an absent husband or a divorced family. A quarter of them. The same can be said for out west. This would be California, Las Vegas, Seattle, Portland, etc. Oakland, which of course is a major black area, the Bay Area of California. Now they tell you that this stuff is the legacy of slavery and all this shit, right? But this is 1960. Now he writes almost 1/4 of Negro families are headed by females. Of course, it's even more today. Talking about it in 2025, it's even more. But let's get into the part that we need to talk about. So his third chapter is on the root of the problem, and he has as the #1 bulletin with slavery. He says American slavery was profoundly different from, and its lasting effects on individuals and their children, indescribably worse than any recorded servitude, ancient or modern. The peculiar nature of American slavery was noted by Alexis de Tocqueville and others, but it was not until 1948 that Frank Tannenbaum, a South American specialist, pointed to the striking differences between Brazilian and American slavery. The feudal and Catholic society of Brazil had a legal and religious tradition, which accorded the slave a place as a human being in the hierarchy of a society, a luckless, miserable place, to be sure, but a place withal. Now, there is a book called The World the Slaveholders Made by Eugene Genovese. That book also talks about this subject. That book would not come out for almost 10 years. This book came out in 1969. Again, Moynihan is writing in 1965. So 4 years later. Okay, so slavery in the United States was unique. Now, they try to explain it in Genovese's book that Spanish, the French, and the British, they had what they call we're going to simplify this thing. We're not going to get into the weeds. We're going to simplify this. All of these are monarchies, right? So they have slavery based on a monarchy. The king allows slaves in the colonies. So what happens is the king allows it, the king can just not allow it. So it says in Eugene Genovese's book that the Dutch stopped participating in the slave trade in 1792 because the king of the Dutch was against it. He basically just signed an order saying the Dutch cannot participate in the slave trade, and that was it. Nobody can overturn the king, so he says no more slavery, and I'm pretty sure they continue colonizing and things like that, but they stopped participating in the slave trade. Now, similarly, in France and Britain, if the king decides there's no more slavery in his territories, then that's it. So what you had with the French and the British, and to a degree with the Spanish, you had what happened in the United States as well, but much later on, you had what's called compensated abolition. What that means is the slave owners were paid money as the king basically take away their slaves. So what happened in the United States is the South was invaded, crops were burned, properties were burned, and because the rights of the slave owners were violated, they got reparations in the United States. Similarly, the slave owners in Britain, France, Spain, or whatever. I know for sure in Britain and Spain and France this happened. They were paid. Now, what the difference being, the United States, their slave owner class was different from the slave owner class of France, Spain, and England. Now, the slave owner class of France, especially, were the bourgeoisie, what they call the bourgeoisie. Basically, they were aristocrats. All right, and what that means is these were guys who had they from noble houses, etc. They don't really their wealth does not come from slavery. They invest in the colonies, but that's not where their primary income comes from. So they engaged in what was called absenteeism. Basically, they owned the plantation, but they did not live there, and they were almost never there. So they would have managers, what we call overseers here in the United States, who would oversee the plantation. So when the slaves were released, they were basically just left on their own on these plantations because they almost never saw the master in the first place. So, but it was different here in the United States because on our system, the master lived on the plantation. So you can't just take his property because he lives there, right? So it's a lot different. So when they talk about how American slavery was different from slavery elsewhere, that's why. Okay. It was different because the slave owners in the United States lived on the property. The slave owners in England, France, Spain, or whatever, they were basically just colonists. They owned the plantation. That means they owned the slaves and they owned the crops, but they didn't live on the plantation. They lived in the main country. So if there was a slave revolt, the masters were rarely killed in those situations because their master was never there. Okay, so it's a completely different situation. That's why slavery in the United States is a unique situation. You also had what they call, again, the overseers historically, I think pretty much throughout history, were actually more abusive than the slave owners because they were closer in rank to the slave, and they had to basically establish themselves. But there's also, of course, a deep conversation about whether slavery was racist or not, which I don't want to get into that right now. We're talking about the family, but I want to discuss the effect slavery had on the family. All right, so they talk about Brazil, which was, of course, unique in its situations. Then he starts talking about Reconstruction. He said, with the emancipation of the slaves, the Negro family began to form in the United States on a widespread scale. But it did so in an atmosphere markedly different from that which has produced the white American family. The Negro was given liberty, but not equality. Life remained hazardous and marginal. Of the greatest importance, the Negro male, particularly in the South, became an object of intense hostility, an attitude unquestionably based in some measure on fear. Then he starts talking about the Jim Crow laws. Now, the explanation for this is something that we also can bounce off of the world the slaveholders made from Eugene Genovese, because what he explains in this book is that once slavery was abolished in the United States, particularly in the South, that gave root to the worst kinds of people. That there were already racists in our society, but the slave owners were rarely as racist as other people. Okay. I forget how he put it. Let me see if I can find how he explains it, which is actually somewhat contradictory to what a lot of people have been saying forever. Okay, so he says on page 1, I think it's 110, that racism under slavery depended on the degree of the slaveholding class having bourgeoisie character, meaning the more bourgeoisie, the more racist. So, in other words, I got it backwards, that the bourgeoisie class was actually more racist than any other group. Okay, and what that means is the more aristocratic a person, the more they came from a rich family or whatever, the more likely they were to harbor prejudice and discriminatory, what they call color prejudice in that book. towards black people. Now this tracks because what you learn throughout history is a lot of poor whites and poor blacks, they have almost always worked together. You know, this is where you get the John Brown revolution and all this kind of stuff, right? Is the poor whites and the poor blacks, they share a certain level of space. But the aristocrats, they look down on everybody, but they look down specifically on the blacks, right? Now, this, of course, tracks also when you think about the Ku Klux Klan, because the Ku Klux Klan, you know, contrary to popular, which you'll see on television, was most likely to be the sheriff, the police officer, a lawyer, or a judge, not some guy in overalls who was planting wheat in the field. He was not likely to be a Klansman. The Klansmen were more likely to be people who had time to socialize in large groups. So it would be most likely some uniformed man in a town somewhere. So we can go through um oh shit, what's his name? Roland Fryer. Yeah, we can go through his paper on the Ku Klux Klan one day, but I don't have time to do it right now. But when we look at what's going on, you see that the more aristocratic the society, the more racist it is. In the United States, rather. So when they busted up slavery, the slave owners, the more aristocratic the slave owner, the more racist he was likely to be. He will also perpetuate all these fears of his daughters being raped by former slaves, or he would fear that the former slaves will revolt and try to get revenge on them and all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, the normal everyday white man just wants to go to work, you know. So you had that sort of situation. Now, here's where we start getting into what I was mentioning earlier. Urbanization. This is what E. Franklin Frazier talks about a lot. Now, in the Moynihan report, it shows that 73% of the United States urban population is Negro. All right? 73% of the United States urban population, that means major American cities, Detroit, Baltimore, Oakland, New York City, Philadelphia, etc., is Negro. All right. And of course, they talk about Negro families are more likely to be raised by women. Okay. Now, the Moynihan report says country life and city life are profoundly different. The gradual shift of American society from a rural to an urban basis over the past century and a half has caused abundant strains, many of which are still in evidence. When this shift occurs suddenly, drastically, in one or two generations, the effect is immensely disruptive of traditional social patterns, right? So, so then he starts quoting E. Franklin Frazier from 1939. So instead of going through that, we're just going to go straight to the source. All right. We're just going to go straight to E. Franklin Frazier. Oh my God. Don't tell me by clicking this, did I drop the other one? Because if I drop that E. Franklin Frazier thing, it's going to take me forever to get back there. It's going to take me forever to get back to the subject that I wanted to get to. Oh, hot damn. Oh no. Yeah. Oh no, there it is. So E. Franklin Frazier, he wrote a book called The Negro Family in the United States. And this is a 777 page document, as I said before. It's cut into various parts where he talks about the Negro family in the United States from emancipation to how that affected parents and how Reconstruction affected parents or whatever. But this piece here is an important piece because this is about urbanization. So, chapter 13 is roving men and homeless women. So, what they're going to tell you is why the urbanization affects the black family so much. And this is gonna fuck your head up. So he says this is from E. Franklin Frazier, a black sociologist. and he's on the left. He was a communist. So was Eugene Genovese, by the way. He's a Marxist. He died a conservative, but he was a Marxist. So this is not something that, people on the left can say that I'm just reading right-wing historians. All right. So E. Franklin Frazier says the mobility of the Negro population, which began as a result of the Civil War and emancipation, tore the Negro family from its customary familial attachments. As the old order crumbled, thousands of Negro men and women began to wander aimlessly about the country or in search of adventure and work in the army camps and cities. In order to meet this situation and at the same time ensure a steady labor supply, the South enacted severe laws to curb the vagrancy of the landless Negro. These will be, of course, your black codes, right? Jim Crow laws and black codes against like vagrancy and basically just hanging around with no job, right? Although the North and this is when it was happening, because again, this was published in 1939. So this stuff was actually like still going on. Although the North, through congressional reconstruction, put an end to these laws, which practically re-enslaved the Negro, Northern industrialists and capitalists were not willing to permit the former slaves to divide and take the land of their former owners. Consequently, the vast majority of the Negroes gradually settled down to a mode of life under a modified plantation system. A large number who had acquired migratory habits during the disordered period following the Civil War continued to drift from place to place. On the other hand, since Reconstruction, the migratory habits of the Negro have been constantly affected by the changing economic and social conditions in the South. It was due primarily to economic conditions that a mass movement was set in motion from Louisiana and Mississippi to Kansas and the West in 1879. But from then until mass migrations during this World War, the mobility of the Negro has consisted of an inconspicuous but steady stream of individuals and families migrating from the farms to lumber and turpentine camps and into the towns and cities of the North and South. All right, I want you, as we're reading this, I want you to realize he's talking about migration during Reconstruction, during Jim Crow. Now, of course, we know that there was more great migrations later on as the cities became more and more industrialized. That gave us huge cities like the one I live in, Detroit, Michigan, where a lot of our grandparents left Mississippi or Alabama or whatever and came up. Maybe they didn't come up in the 20s or the 30s. Maybe they came up in the 50s or the 60s, right? Okay. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Because among the million Negroes who deserted the rural communities of the South, there were thousands of men and women who cut themselves loose from family and friends and sought work and adventure as solitary wanderers from place to place. Some of the men had their first glimpse of the world beyond the plantation or farm when they worked in sawmills, turpentine camps, or on the roads. Some of the women had their first experience with city life when they went to a nearby town to work temporarily for a few dollars in domestic service. But a large number of them had become accustomed to going into town on Saturday afternoons to escape the boredom of the rural community. Then these towns offered comparative freedom from the religious restraints imposed by the rural churches. So they leave in their small podunk farm and they go into the speakeasies in town. They go into the club. Great great grandma and great great grandpa, who might have been a farmer, still went to the clubs in the early 1900s. Okay. He says, in these dance halls that they called them, these simple peasant folk could give rein to their repressed impulses without incurring the censure of the elders for their, quote, sinful conduct. Even before the cinema and the radio revealed a larger outside world of romance and adventure, they could hear from the mouth of some, quote, black Ulysses fabulous stories of the outside world. This was the black Ulysses. I don't think we're going to get too much into that, but this is basically like a traveling musician or some kind of traveling worker, usually a man who goes from town to town and talks about, ooh, them girls down there in Atlanta, boy, I don't know, they so hot down there. Like he would go into the towns and talk about all the places that he'd been, all the things that he'd seen, and all these guys who had never left their plantation, they would hear this and be like, what? The girls down in Atlanta doing what now? And then they want to go see too. you know, like they're hearing about this shit and they're like, what? They doing what down there? Like they sinful conduct. Oh, brother. Continuing, E. Franklin Frazier says, once having caught a glimpse of the world beyond the dull routine of country life, these men and women were lured on to a world beyond these small towns where they might enjoy even greater freedom and more exciting adventures. He's calling them adventures. They're adventuring. They're not building families. They're going on adventures. They're going to the dance halls, baby. See, they don't talk about this, right? E. Franklin Frazier was a communist, by the way. But when you see that the destruction of the black family was one part choice, then you understand why we keep getting that legacy of slavery bullshit. And that's why it don't work. People make decisions. Now, we're going to go back to E. Franklin Frazier, and we're going to get a little bit more detailed. He says, in the lumber and turpentine camps, one may get a glimpse of the free sex behavior and spontaneous matings which these roving men and homeless women form during their wanderings. These camps offer greater anonymity and freedom from social control than the small towns. So you have guys who are working at these camps and in these lumber yards, and there was women coming around, these women with no husbands, women with no boyfriends. They're just floating about, and maybe they're prostituting. They're out there, maybe they're out there tricking. You don't know. But there's a lot more women on these sites than there was back on the plantation. Is that they bring men and women from the farms in contact with men and women who have already had some experience in the outside world. Often some black troubadour, that would be musician, meets a simple girl in a town and lures her with his romantic tales and strange words of love to take up her abode with him in the camp. In the dozen or more hastily constructed one-room wooden structures which comprise these camps, one find many such couples. So you see these women having one-night stands with these traveling musicians and other sorts of quote-unquote adventurers. These small town girls are being wooed by big city adventurers. Okay? It says, since these couples are drawn together by spontaneous attraction, in which physical desire usually predominates, their association is characterized by impulsive behavior. Quarreling and fighting as the result of outbursts of jealousy or slight irritations occur periodically. The character of their association depends on their past experiences. Men who have become hardened by their wandering life and believe that men should rule women with an iron hand often treat their temporary mates with brutality and only occasionally show any sympathy or tender feeling towards them. On the other hand, the men who have retained some of their humanity, of their simple folk background, may find in these women the response which their mothers once furnished. Therefore, one may find these men and women living together as married couples. The woman does the cooking and looks after her mate's clothing while he furnishes the food and buys her a dress or gigaw in town. I don't know what the fuck a gigaw is. I wasn't expecting to see that word. But even such peaceful and happy associations are of short duration. The man or even the woman may take a fancy to another companion, or when the camp breaks up, the man begins anew his wanderings. Deserted, the woman may return to her mother to seek forgiveness for her sin, the sign of which may be an illegitimate child. In other cases, the woman may follow her lover on his odyssey. So, people are traveling from town to town looking for work. Some of them are musicians. Some of them are, of course, laborers. And they're hooking up in the towns with small, simple girls and leaving the girls pregnant. And they're just leaving them. And sometimes the girl is dumb and she follows him. Like this is the kind of stuff they used to write. They used to write books about. This is something like Zora Neale Hurston would have wrote a novel about, right? So he blames a lot of this on the blues. He starts talking about blues singers, what they call the Black Ulysses, right? I'm skipping ahead, but he's talking about how these songs are some of the songs are kind of they're not vulgar. They're not certainly not as vulgar as songs today, but how romance and love and all these things were a central theme of music, and it would use it to attract women. See, so the Black Ulysses continued his wanderings from city to city. During the course of his wanderings in the South, he may pick up a lonesome woman in domestic service who will satisfy his sexual cravings and furnish him with food and lodging for a night or two. Incidents in the career of one of these wanderers from Tennessee throw some light on the character of this mobile group. He began his sex experiences when 14 as a result of the example of and instruction of older boys. At the present time, his sexual life is entirely of a casual nature. When he arrives in a city, he approaches women on the street or gets information on accessible women from men of his type. Usually, he goes up to lonely women in domestic service and wins their sympathy by telling them hard luck stories of his life on the road. They take him up to their lodgings, where he remains until his hunger as well as his sexual desires are satisfied, and then he takes to the road again. Occasionally, he sends a card to a woman to whom he takes a special liking, but usually he forgets them. That's crazy, right? There's actually, because E. Franklin Frazier is a sociologist, and what sociologists typically do is they go out and they find these kinds of people that they're talking about, and they do an interview with them. So he had a conversation with one of these, what they call Black Ulysses, you know, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a bit long. But this guy says that he's been working since he was 9 years old. He's traveled from Chattanooga to Atlanta, a couple of days in Chicago, a couple of days in New Orleans, et cetera, et cetera. He just moves around a lot. He doesn't sit still, you know. Um, and he was 14 when he had his first sexual experience. And then he says, as these men and women wander about, they slough off the traditional attitudes and beliefs that provided a philosophy of life in the world of the folk. A young man who came north during the migrations of the war period furnishes the following narrative. I'm not going to go into that. I'm not going to read any of these narratives, but they're in there. They exist. You know, so it says 52% of these men claimed that they had been married, and of these, three-fourths has simply deserted their wives. Three-fourths of these Black Ulysses traveling vagrants got married, and 75% of them just walked away from their wives. So, is this the legacy of slavery? That you would just walk away from your wife? No, 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 it's not actually. It's it's some guys making it. It's men and women making a decision. They're deciding to engage in, hurriedly put together weddings or casual sex, and these men are just leaving them. So it says a similar situation in regard to family disorganization was found among the 7,560 unattached Negro males registered with the Unattached and Transient Division of the Emergency Relief Bureau in New York City. Slightly more than 42% of these men were under the age of 35. A study of the sample of 522 cases showed that in the case of the men in Chicago shelters, 52% had been married. However, about a third of them were separated from their wives, and another 13% claimed to be widowed, while only 6% admitted they had deserted their wives or families. So, 52% of these guys that they found in shelters had been married, and 30% of them had walked away from the family. So, they tell you it's the legacy of slavery. It's not the legacy of slavery at all. It's not the legacy of slavery at all, is it? It's not the legacy of slavery at all, brother. It's a lie. They're lying to you. They're lying to you. So he says, generally, by the time these wandering men and women reach their northern metropolis, they have lost much of their naive outlook on life and have become sophisticated in the ways of the city. Their songs are no longer the spontaneous creations of the uprooted peasant, disillusioned and lonely, yearning for the association of kin and neighbors. When they sing the blues, which represents the conscious creations of songwriters who supply songs for more sophisticated sentiments and behavior. Again, he's blaming a lot of this on the blues. Basically, blues singers, which a lot of them were on drugs, traveling from town to town. I don't think that the heroin was a big deal yet. It will become a big deal, of course, in the 50s and 60s. Now, of course, they talk about pimping and stuff like that in here too. I'm not going to go into that though. Excuse me. It says, some of the men and women of the foregoing type are strangers to the background of the simple-minded peasant Negro from the South. But it often happens that they are the children of migrants and have been bred in the slum areas of northern cities and are more sophisticated than migrants from the South. So they're telling you that some of these people who travel from town to town having out of wedlock sex or getting married and deserting their wives, they were likely the children of Southern migrants themselves who had already been left behind, or their parents were from the South. So he talks about some of the homeless women. You call them homeless. Basically, I guess we're talking about prostitutes. That would be one of the ways that you would explain it. They would have to be prostitutes because they're using the word like daddy in here. And that's a big thing. And if I remember correctly, Iceberg Slim's book was written in the 1930s and 1940s, something like that, around this same time. So pimping and stuff like that is a big deal at this point in time. So that was the entire chapter, which kind of explains that it is not the legacy of slavery that has destroyed the black family. It was increased opportunity for sex. That's what urbanization, it was lax social rules and increased temptations. That's what it is. It is a human failure. It is not people getting arrested because that would come. People were getting arrested more then for being vagrants than now. And even then, you talk about mass incarceration that they call it. It's still your responsibility to not get arrested for selling dope or whatever, carrying a gun or speeding or whatever the fuck, right? So they try to blame mass incarceration. They try to blame the legacy of slavery. None of this had to do with what we're talking about here. It's a choice. These people were making a conscious decision to have sex with relative strangers, in some cases even marrying them. And the guy would just walk off. He would disappear. And this is still happening today, where girls are giving up the goods and then they get ghosted. Ain't nothing changed. Ain't nothing changed at all. Now, the next chapter is called The Flight from Feudal America. I don't think I read this entire chapter. But it's another conversation about migrants going to different industries. Detroit for the automobiles. I don't think this is really discussing what happened to the family structure. But they got away from small town churches and they started hanging out in the clubs, what they would call the dance halls back in the day, the speakeasies, and they was loose. They had loose morals, and it's the same people today. They have loose morality. It's not the legacy of slavery at all. But the next chapter is more about economics. It's more about economics, because he actually starts getting into how blacks are starting to become more socialist. I'm not going to get into that because I'm pretty sure he's very happy about that, but I'm not. So they're going to move on. So there it is. It's very, very interesting that when you hear about the legacy of slavery and all this stuff, take into account that people was seeing new experiences back then. They're leaving the plantation for the first time. Now they have options about who to mate with. You're not just, this is a cute girl. Maybe somebody is setting you up with this young girl in the church or something like that. Now you can go out and pick your own. And this hot little somebody down the road might want to throw you a bone or two, and you're like, hell yeah, let's go for it. She just, just a loose girl, and she probably banging you with 2 or 3 other guys, but ain't no big deal. Your nose is open at this point. And then over time, there's more migrancy, there's more vagrancy. And then if you think that this is false, look at Lil Wayne. How many children does Lil Wayne have? 6? How many different baby mamas do he got? Like 5 or 6? He's got multiple baby mamas. And it's the exact same thing that E. Franklin Frazier was discussing in that chapter. He's a traveling musician who goes from town to town. He probably has some model in a town somewhere where he's messing around with her. She gets pregnant. He just keeps on going. Now, he can't disappear because, it's 2008 or something like that. And, it's just too easy to find Lil Wayne at that point. But it's the exact same situation. It's the same thing with ball players. Basketball players are going from town to town. They're constantly traveling. They're shacking up with strippers. They're shacking up with all kind of dirty broads, getting them pregnant and leaving them. I mean, are we we not off base here, are we? And this is why when people say I shouldn't be reading a lot of this old stuff, it's like, what are you talking about? Why shouldn't I read this old shit? This stuff informs what's happening today. This stuff is still happening today. You didn't learn anything from history. You're just repeating it. Didn't they just catch this white boy? What was his name? Harry Sisson? He was juggling a bunch of girls off Snapchat because nobody can check what he's doing on Snapchat. He got like 3 or 4 different girls he's juggling, right? And he's a white guy. So if you know he's doing it, you know that there's some black rapper out here doing it. There's some homeboys up the block who got a little bit of money who's doing it. And that transient lifestyle, that's the dope boy lifestyle. Dope boys, they might have somewhere where they lay, but oftentimes they jump from couch to couch. They disappear. They're not easy to catch all the time. They're not easy to find. Sometimes they don't even give you their real name. Some of these broads be pregnant by dudes don't even know what his first name is. So we done went through all of this, from the dance halls to the lack morality of the 60s, to the freakniks of the 80s and 90s, to the twerk generation that we're still in now. All this shit is the same. You have individuals who make the decision to engage in which you could say is sexual liberation, quote unquote. But it has negative outcomes. And that negative outcome is that people end up with children that they're not raising. And so when like these black conservatives show up and they tell you, hey, stop having children out of wedlock. And they say, well, it's the legacy of slavery. It's the legacy of slavery. It's not the legacy of slavery at all. As a matter of fact, let's go through one of these clips now. I just remembered I got it bookmarked on my Twitter account. It's from Delano Squires. He's big on family and stuff. I think he was on Fox News recently. So, shit, that's great. It's it's queued up perfectly too. So let's see what we got here.
So marriage rates are trending downward to an all-time low. Only 47% of Americans are married today, compared to 78% in 1950.
And birth rates are also at their lowest levels, down nearly 50% since 1960. So what does this mean for our culture and our future society? Heritage Foundation Research Fellow in the Center for Life, Religion, and Family, Delano Squires, joins us now. Delano, it's so great to have you on. I saw this.
So let's go back for a bit. Like they showed you that 78% of United States marriages, or the 78% of people were married in 1950. Less than 50% are married today. Now, they don't separate this by race. I'm pretty sure it'll be higher amongst blacks. But then they talk about the birth rate went from 3.65 in 1960 to 1.62. That means most people don't have children. Or if people are having children, they only have one. Amazing.
Foundation Research Fellow in the Center for Life, Religion, and Family, Delano Squires, joins us now. Delano, it's so great to have you on. I saw this post that you put on X, and I sent it to our producers immediately because I'm fascinated by everything that you're uncovering. So why don't you just first break down what you're seeing society-wise and how these numbers matter to us?
Sure. So what we're seeing based on the data is that Americans are getting married less and later. The marriage rate has gone down significantly over the past 50 years, and the age of first marriage has gone up. So for instance, in 1980, the average man and woman got married around 24 and 22 respectively. Today, it's about 31 and 29 years old. So we're getting married less and later. Married households are no longer the norm. As the graphic shows, about 78% of married households in 1950, 47% of American households are married couple households today. Fewer children are being born, but more are being born outside of wedlock. So about 40% of American children are born to unmarried parents today, compared to about 5% in 1960.
40% of the children are born out of wedlock. If you take into account all the negativity that we know about children with one parent, just one missing parent, usually the father, but one missing parent, how that puts such economic stress on the other parent. How can you start claiming things like economic inequality is because of racism when women are raising children by themselves and have to pay rent, go to work, take care of the children, yada, yada, yada? When are they going to start building wealth? Of course, there's going to be wealth inequality. You have an entire generation of women raising children by themselves. So how are they building wealth? She's got to work by herself. She got to take care of the kids by herself. And then this also means that the kid is going to have a tough upbringing because mom is not likely to be a multimillionaire. So the likelihood of him having things that are up to date in terms of clothes, video games, and all that kind of stuff, and kids get teased for not having that kind of stuff, that could push him towards crime. Specifically things like stealing and selling drugs, which is a choice, by the way. It's not a, they try to act like it's, well, he ain't got no choice. They got a choice. God damn it.
So all of these things, and one of the other things is not only has fertility dropped, but for the first time probably in American history, there are more adults who have ever cohabited than who are currently married. So all of these trends point to the American family in some ways coming apart. And I think this is one of the reasons that you hear policymakers, particularly on the right, starting to think more about family and what we can do to bring the household back together again.
So I don't have kids and I'm not married. So is this an intervention? I don't know. Lisa, we have something to talk about.
We need to talk to you about something.
But I guess the question is why? Why do you think this is happening?
I think there's several factors at play, right? I think one, men and women are now putting off marriage longer to focus on, personal and professional goals. Social scientists will talk about the difference between the cornerstone model of marriage, where people got married younger and the marriage was the foundation of the life they built together, as opposed to the capstone model of marriage, where people get married older after they have, as I said, reached several personal and professional milestones. I also think we just live in a different culture, right? Where marriage, I don't think, has the same value or the same desirability to many men and women. For many years, I think.
Let's pause for a second. There is a book called Bowling Alone, but it talks about the death of social clubs. And if I remember correctly, I think we went through that book before. But when you discuss relationships, you have to realize that we're becoming a lot more atomized in our society as well. There's a lot of people living in these homes and places alone, and they don't really leave. Like, they don't go anywhere. Like, they may get together with their friends and go to the bar, but that's it. 60 years ago, people had clubs. And I don't mean like nightclubs. I mean, there were women's groups. There were church outings. There was, Elks Lodge. There was Masons clubs, what they call the Illuminati, the Boule and all them. Those kinds of groups were more prevalent, and you were apt to meet people of your same social class back then. Today, you're only meeting, most people, I would imagine, are meeting online, right? And they're swiping each other without getting to know each other at all. They're looking at each other's pictures and swipe, swipe, swipe. They don't know each other from a can of paint, right? But 50 years ago, you might have been in a social group with a young lady, met her, fell in love with her, she fell in love with you, you got married and had kids. Fewer and fewer people are joining all of these social groups now. There are almost none anymore. In that book, Bowling Alone by David Putnam, if I remember his name was correct, explains all of those groups falling apart. Let me see if I can get that book off my shelf. How much longer Delano got? He got about a minute. Let's see if I can find that book on my shelf.
All right. Where marriage, I don't think, has the same value or the same desirability to many men and women. For many years, I think people would say, second wave feminism sent women the message that marriage was an oppressive tool of the patriarchy, and that the prison, in some respects, is a home. And I think there's a rise, particularly online, of men saying it's a bad deal.
Delano, we have very little time. I just want you to very quickly tell us what are the consequences of less marriage and less babies.
Well, I mean, there's certain consequences for down the road economically. But I think one of the consequences is that we're not going to be as satisfied as people if we don't have families. And I think we're starting to see that even right now in our society.
Delano, thank you so much. This is it.
All right. So I do have this book. I was forced to read it in college. It's called Bowling Alone. It's written by Robert D. Putnam. I thought his name was David Putnam. It's Robert Putnam. And they discuss in this book the death of civic engagement. And they talk about the political, civic, religious, workplace, and other sorts of organizations that have began to suffer in the United States. And with the fall of these groups, you started having the itemization of man. Men started having fewer and fewer friends. Now most boys don't have any friends, right? So they're not making friends. So they're certainly not making girlfriends. So they're certainly not getting married. Okay? So it's a routine thing that you can see. It's a domino effect. So chapter 15 from the chapter 15 from the Robert D. Putnam Bowling Alone book. The American family structure has changed in several important and potentially relevant ways over the last decades. The downturn in civic engagement coincided with the breakdown of the traditional family unit, mom, dad, and the kids. Since the family itself is, by some accounts, a key form of social capital, perhaps its eclipse is part of the explanation for the reduction in joining and trusting in the wider community. I would say it's also the other way around as well, because sometimes people met their wives in church. Sometimes people met their wives at a bowling league. Sometimes people met their wives in some kind of art group or art club or something like that. And that's happening less and less now. Dating in various places is gone now for the most part. So he says, this is Putnam, marriage and children do change the kinds of social networks to which one belongs. Both marriage and children increase time spent in community organizations and at home, and decrease time spent in informal socializing with friends. Only two types of organizational affiliations, however, are sufficiently strong related to marital and parental status to make a real difference in the aggregate: church and youth-related activities. Americans who are married and those with children are more likely to be involved in religious activities, including church membership, church attendance, and church-related social activities. Okay, so not surprisingly, parents are also more involved in school and youth groups, and they are more likely to attend public or town meetings on school affairs. Finally, since church and youth-related activities are the two most common sites for volunteering in America, parents are more likely to volunteer, than people of the same age and social status who are single and childless. So, it all begins and ends with the family. It ain't the legacy of slavery at all. What it is people making decisions, and we could go through, the effects of feminism, which is what a lot of guys are talking about now in the comment section, where you have this what they call what is called the sexual harassment industry, where if you approach a girl in a class, or you approach her on while she's standing at a water fountain or something like that, you're likely to get slapped with some kind of sexual harassment thing. As opposed to back in 1970, there was no such thing. But in recent years, the policing of personal relationships, and I'm talking about this policing of personal relationships, is pretty extreme as well. Because now they're starting to argue about people's quote unquote age gaps, right? So I saw a video of a young lady. She seemed to probably be in her early 20s, and she was questioning why her parents had such a huge age gap, and just completely disrespectful, because it was, for starters, none of her fucking business. To be questioning your parents about why your mom is 15 years younger than your dad or whatever the hell, right? Ultimately, it's a weird situation that they've created. That it's a mixture of things, right? Because the reason why people don't date anymore is, part of that is due to being atomized. There's no social groups, there's no social events going on for you to participate in. If there are, they're probably far away and you're not likely to know about it. But then it's more than likely going to end up being a sausage party if you're a guy, or a peach party if you're a girl. And a lot of times that's by design. For instance, especially when it comes to things that women do, they specifically want women's only activities. They, of course, decry men's only activities, but typically they want women's only activities. So they'll have like bridal showers or things like this, where all the girls get together and they'll do painting with a twist or something like that. And if you're the guy who wants to go hang out, then you're a creep. You're a weirdo, because why would you want to hang out with the girls? Because that's where the girls are. Shit, if you're a guy trying to meet a girl, you can't go where the girls are, because all the girls are going together. They put it together where they're going to go on their own. So that only leaves that a girl's going to maybe get involved in some kind of spontaneous sexual activity in the club. She take a guy home. She just randomly give a guy her number or something like that. That might work for you. But now there's no groups. People used to volunteer and work together. Now they don't. It's not a surprise then. But it's certainly not the legacy of slavery. Look at all the things that we've talked about rather than the legacy of slavery. And then you can always tie this to real world activities, real world things that you see people doing, real world issues that you see people engaging in. It ain't the legacy of slavery that people are cheating on their girlfriends or whatever with Snapchat. It didn't exist in slavery. It ain't that you're sliding in some girl's DMs on Instagram. It's poor behavior. It's poor morale. It's poor moral behavior. That's what it boils down to. It's immorality, period. It is your fault for the most part. Now, again, there are things that occur that are outside of your control for the most part. But primarily, people whose families have fallen apart is usually due to their own behavior. Or that they got led astray by somebody else. But people aren't getting married anymore. And a lot of that has to do with feminism. A lot of that also has to do with you're not really meeting people anywhere anymore. Because where are you going to meet them except you talk to somebody in order to get their IG or their Facebook or whatever, and then you almost talk to them exclusively on there. People barely even talk on the phone anymore. Just think about that. People barely even talk on the phone. But that urbanization thing is real because urbanization became an issue when it became possible for you to travel far distances easier, right? Like, sure, I'm almost willing to guess there ain't a bunch of guys jumping on their horses from Alabama and riding up to Chicago. They probably got on some kind of train, or they probably hopped in somebody's car and rode up there. They hopped on the bus or something like that to go from town to town. Technology changed. You got more access to more women. More access to more women, you have more casual sex. And then even back then, there wasn't a lot of women in the colleges. And then you had a big boom of women in the colleges, so you started having a bunch of women having sex on college campuses, having sex in the workplace, having affairs with their boss, having affairs with classmates, having affairs with all these other people. And then the feminists got a hold of it and turned everything into a goddamn landmine. So there it is. That's essentially my presentation. Marcus Gray says, "Me Too also ruined dating at the workplace." Yep. Good luck dating in the workplace. I wouldn't suggest it. I would not suggest dating somebody that you work with. You're only asking for trouble at that point. I can guarantee you that. It's almost a guaranteed trip to human resources. And understand, with the way human resources is today, you don't have to sexually harass that person for them to file a sexual harassment complaint. If you got a little hot thing at the job and you pinch her butt and somebody sees it, they can say, look, he's been inappropriate at the workplace. And they're not going to say, mind your own business. They're going to call you into HR and say, what are you doing? What are you doing to Teresa over there? Oh, she's my friend. She ain't complaining. Well, no, but somebody else did. And you're like, what? But that's still valid. If they hear you talking about somebody, even if that person is not present, it's still sexual harassment. Understand, do not pitch woo at the workplace. You will lose your job. And it also just turns the workplace into a big old soap opera where, people go from eating lunch together to not even speaking to each other to next thing you know, one or both of them are about to get fired. You said you can't even approach a girl without a cop firsthand experience. Well, I can tell you this. People need groups and things so that they can feel comfortable around other people. I have not heard of Dr. George Frazier. Feel free to leave in the comments something that for me to look into. If I could find a PDF or something, that would be interesting. Philip Brown says the problems with the black community has nothing to do with slavery or white supremacy. It's mostly self-inflicted, including homelessness. I agree. I will say this. There are a subsection of people for whom their homelessness is not their fault, and that is people who are consistently and persistently mentally ill. Those people are, otherwise disabled. Like some people with severe bipolar disorder, they have burned every bridge, so they can't go live with anybody, and they're too impulsive or whatever, or they're maybe even unmedicated, and it's difficult for them to manage their own lives. That's an issue. Somebody who has severe schizophrenia is more likely to be out there on the street. I'm just down bad. And I think they're a very different situation than people who are just irresponsible. That would be drug addicts, gamblers, folks who just don't take care of their money, all that kind of stuff. That's completely different from somebody who is, and maybe the bipolar disorder, the schizophrenia was triggered by drug use, maybe, but in some cases these things go. These are people who have been dealing with this stuff for a long time, and they just can't get the handle on it. And in some cases, they're irresponsible too because they don't take medicine. They get the meds, and they get thrown in a psych hospital, and they may get on some medication. It clears their mind up a little bit, manages their mood swings or whatever. And then as soon as they leave the hospital, they just pour all that shit in the garbage and don't bother going to their outpatient appointments or nothing like that. And look, that's real. But I will give a pass to the persistent and severe mentally ill. In terms of it not being their fault, because that's genetic to a degree. But for the most part, yes. A whole lot of guys end up homeless because they were living with a girlfriend, they got caught cheating, and now they ain't got nowhere to go. Like that's their own fault. A lot of people run away from home. That's their own fault. Like there's only so much you can do for people who are irresponsible. And there's people out there who think that you should bend your entire society around irresponsible people, but that's not going to work. That's not going to work at all. How are you going to bend your entire society around people who are irresponsible? You might as well take money and throw it in a furnace at that point. They're already irresponsible. They're not going to become more responsible because you gave them more money. That doesn't make any sense. WG Phil says, do you consider Nat Turner a hero, considering he allowed slaves to get killed and he hid for weeks during the crackdown? Well, the thing about slave revolts is you gotta take the bitter with the sweet. I can understand why a Nat Turner or a Denmark VC and all these people would do what they did. Nat Turner, I think, may have had visions and other kinds of problems that went along with why he engaged in the things he engaged in. But I also, if I remember correctly, he killed children, and there's just no good reason for that. But then again, there's people out there who are going to say, well, the kids were part of the problem. They were on the plantation. Like, yeah, but the kids couldn't own the property. You didn't belong to the child. You more than likely belong to the man of the house. And I can understand, defending yourself from him. But killing the children, I can't deal with that. But I don't know, because I can recognize both sides of the story on something like a Nat Turner or a slave revolt. If I was a slave, I definitely would have revolted or would have ran away. It's probably more efficient to run away because, if you're from a big plantation, they might not miss you. If you're from a smaller one, they might chase you. But the chances of you vanishing after you run is, well, depending on where you are. Like if you're running from like Georgia, man, you got a far way to go. If you're running from like Virginia, maybe not that far. But if you're from the deep south, like you from Florida, running away probably ain't gonna do you no good. AJ3 says college campus has become the new Freaknik. Yeah, but then you're not allowed to touch the merchandise or engage in anything in any way. So, all right, y'all. I appreciate everybody for stopping by, man. Thank you for spending the time with me. I'll talk to you guys later. The Generous Sharing guy slipped in the last minute. He got some comments. He says, yeah, but the thing is, the kids are going to grow up to be future slave owners anyways. Not necessarily, because in some situations, when the slave owner died, he released the slaves. I believe, was it George Washington that did that? That upon his death, his slaves were emancipated, and those kind of things happen. And just because, the kid was going to grow up to be a slave owner doesn't mean that he's going to grow up to be the same kind of slave owner his parents was. It's entirely possible that maybe his dad was a hard ass and would not let you buy your own freedom, but maybe the kid would, you know. And sometimes if a slave and a kid grew up in the same house, you might have a certain kind of relationship with that kid, you know. But under no circumstances are I'm going to sit here and make an excuse that it's okay to murder children because of what they might do in the future. That literally doesn't make any sense. Degenerate Trigon says, I mean, there's no denying that, harsh, but what can you do? Well, what is the child a threat? How can a child be a threat to you? Unless the child's like 15 or something like that. Like if he's old enough to operate a weapon, then maybe. If he's like, 15, 16, he can go get the rifle and you kill him. Maybe that's, self-defense. But if the kid is like 10 or 11, even if he's old enough to pick up the rifle, he probably not that much of a threat to you. You're probably more scared than anything. But I'm not going to sit here and make any excuses about killing kids. And again, I guess unless the kid's going to kill you, or you fear that the kid's going to kill you, you have a good reason to believe the kid's going to kill you, or try to kill you. So there's that. AJ3 says Lincoln freed the slaves, but he's still considered racist. And why? Because he was a racist. And he made it clear that he only was going to free the slaves to hurt the Southern economy. He didn't really care about slaves. He said it in his own papers that if he could maintain the Union without freeing one slave, he would. He didn't care about slaves. It was not about slaves. It was about Northern industrialists wanting access to Southern markets. Well, that's what it was for the North. They hid behind the moral garbage of their anti-slavery. But there's always more than one thing. W.G. Field says Lincoln tried to relocate slaves back to the States. He tried to relocate them back to Africa. And in that situation, most of them were born in the United States and had never lived in Africa. Again, you're talking about slaves who have been probably brought over in the country in the early 1800s. They had children, and a lot of those people have never been to Africa. Why the hell would you repatriate them back to Africa? They never been there in the first place. That's why so many of them didn't go. They had never even been there in the first place. They were born in this country. Very unique circumstances. But then again, I don't think that happened anywhere. They took black slaves from West Africa and took them to Haiti, took them to Brazil and Jamaica, Cuba. And I don't remember anywhere where a large number of those people went back. Why would you go back? By that point in time, you're born somewhere, you learn the language. You don't know the language of your old home. You don't know the religion of that place. You probably have bits and pieces of it that you maybe learned from your parents or grandparents, but that's about it. There is no going back because you've never been there in the first place. Yeah, Lincoln tried to play both sides. I mean, he didn't want a civil war, but he was happy to oblige it once it happened. Because ultimately, and this is always going to be a talking point, but it is what it is. The Southern economy was slow in compared to the North. They had resources down there in land and acreage that was used for plantations that other people wanted. That's what it boils down to, man. AJ3 says, I saw a short clip of Dr. Frazier talking about the marriage in the black family, which is down 34%, which all lie to the topic of this video. All right, let me put that in real quick. I was gonna wrap this thing up, but let's see if I can. Oh shit! I put Dr. Frazier in. I didn't put the first name. Oh, here it is. Wait, the very first video is Black people are heading into a second slavery. What? I'm really just kind of like, okay, just based off that, I'm about ready to be like, I'm not fucking around with this. But let me look for what you're talking about. Let's put in Dr. Frazier family. Oh, here it is, right here. Dr. Frazier Black family.
71% of our sisters are not married. 29% will never get married. 63% of our brothers are not married. 30% of them will never get married. There is no culture in the history of humankind that has risen to maximize their full human potential without family at the center of their culture. This only exists. This is an interesting but negative statistic. This phenomenon of the existential crisis of our family only exists among African American Black people. It does not exist on the continent or anywhere else in the diaspora. So there must be something in the water. We must fix this. It is a lot easier said than done because it is impacting our wealth. Quick statistics. For 350 years, household median income was dominated by white people. They were number one in this country. They no longer are number one, they're number three. And there's a reason for it. So, who has the highest household median wealth in America?
Indians.
It's East Indians. $104,000 a year.
I
What's
knew
the
it.
marriage rate in the East Indian culture? 94%. Two are working. Who's number two?
Asians.
Chinese Asians. Household median income $110,000 a year. Marriage rate close to 70%. Number three are white people. Household median income $88,000 a year. What's the marriage rate? Almost 50%. Down significantly. Number four are Hispanics. Household median income.
I'm gonna pause it for a second. I notice Arabs never make this list. Arabs, and I can speak because I know a few, they still engage in arranged marriages in some Arabic populations. So I know that maybe the population isn't big enough to have a real effect yet, but those Arabs, man, they are more often than not married too. They're married and they get married young, you know, because when I was in college, I was in a class with an Arab guy whose parents had picked his wife already, and he was incredibly frustrated. And then he said he made it even worse for himself because he slept with her and didn't tell his parents, and they weren't married yet. So he was stuck with this girl that he didn't like because for starters his parents had picked her, and secondly he had went on ahead and slept with her. So but I don't think I've ever met an unmarried Arab or an Arab that was not at least engaged. Especially when I was in college, I think they all were married. Now I don't know if that was a good thing because it wasn't good for him, but it is, you know. But they never make these lists.
$61,000 a year, marriage rate close to 70%. We are at the bottom. Household median income $55,000 a year. Marriage rate 34%, and projected based on facts and statistics that if we do not fix this, because white folks ain't fixing this, our marriage rate will be in the low teens in the next 20 years. This is an enormous challenge. That's a whole talk by itself on how do we fix it. It can be fixed, but But we have to, first of all, understand that this is a problem. No one's talking about this problem. This is a huge problem. It's the #1 problem in our culture. So we must fix it.
Yeah, people talk about it all the time. I feel, but thankfully I actually looked at this video because I was like, man, I saw that first thing and I was like, I don't know, man. We headed back to another slavery. That's kind of ridiculous, but yeah, he was on point. He looks like a white man. He must be super mixed. He must be mixed with everything. I never heard of this guy before. Interesting. Okay. All right, y'all. I appreciate everybody for stopping by. Thank you guys for your time. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.